Welcome to Exploring A Course in Miracles. I'm Emily Perry with the Circle of Atonement, here with Circle founder Robert Perry. And today we're talking about the ego's version of love. This conversation was sparked by a recent New York Times opinion piece by David Brooks called The Wrong Definition of Love. And both Robert and I found ourselves very struck by it, mainly because the thrust of Brooks's message is something that we've been talking about here at the Circle for many years. And it's something that A Course in Miracles itself flags as a root cause of why our relationships start with so much promise and so often collapse into what we've called the spiritual disease of hate. And we all know the symptoms of this disease. We're not getting along. And we're not getting along, whether that's in our personal relationships, in our communities, or in society at large. And the reasons for all of this dysfunction that we see around us aren't exactly obvious when we ourselves are in the thick of it. But if you zoom out, and this is what Brooks is talking about in his article, and what the Course is talking about as well. If you zoom out, a clear pattern for why all of this dysfunction is occurring emerges. And the pattern is that for generations, what has held us together has been shared cultural, moral, and even spiritual values. But over time, those shared values have been slowly replaced by other values. And specifically, what Brooks is talking about in his article and what we've been talking about here at the Circle is that the shared spiritual values, the moral and ethical values, have been replaced by therapeutic values that take the focus off the collective to center in on the self. This is what we've been describing here at the Circle as the cult of self, which is the heavy focus these days on self-love, self-care, self-protection, self-expression, and so on. And while all of that can be very healthy, when the focus on the self replaces the focus on the collective, that's where we get into trouble, because that's where we're actually left more fragmented and isolated, which is exactly what we're seeing now. So, Robert, after that setup, as you know, what we thought we'd do for our conversation today is to walk through David Brooks's op-ed in the New York Times. Again, this is called The Wrong Definition of Love. But before we do that, you were saying earlier today that a big theme of the article, which is our cultural shift from shared collective values to individual values, is something that has been on your radar for a very long time. So as we get started here, can you say more about what alerted you to this idea originally and why it means so much to you personally?
I think a somewhat short version is that I got into spirituality in the late 70s. And as time has gone on, I've noticed that our whole culture has kind of gotten swept up in this idea that we're going to be talking about as we go through this conversation. But it's an idea where it's really all about you and your own well being. And that gets into protecting yourself from other people because it's all about you and look what they've done to you. Um, it involves kind of de-emphasizing notions of truth, and it involves what you and I have called an avoidance of God. So all of that has, like, I've been swimming in waters for 45 years that I'm uncomfortable with. And now I slowly realize it's not just the course community. It's not just the spiritual community. It's it's the national, it's the global community. And it's hard not to connect that attitude with an erosion of the ties that bind us together as a society.
David Brooks began his piece by talking about a poll that was done on how people fall in love. And the responses to the poll were things like, I fall in love when someone sees me in a way that I didn't know I could be seen. The responses were things like, falling in love is when, quote, someone sees you in the absolute mess of it, your pain, your pettiness, your unpaid parking tickets, etc. And Brooks likened these answers to a Raymond Carver poem called Late Fragment. And the poem is short, so I'll read it. The poem is basically a narrator talking to someone else, and it goes like this. And did you get what you wanted from this life, even so? I did. And what did you want? To call myself beloved, to feel myself beloved on the earth. Now, we read this, we hear this. The very first time I heard it, I was like, that's beautiful. Well, that's really a truly wonderful thing to feel beloved on this earth. Who isn't looking for that? But what Brooks is pointing to is that both of these examples, the people who were polled and the poem, speak to a picture of love as somebody else makes us feel understood and somebody else makes us feel good about ourselves. We call it love, but the focus is on us being seen and the focus is on how we feel versus the other person. And so the obvious question that Brooks is asking, that we are asking, and that the course is asking is, can that really be love?
There was a great summary that Brooks had in the piece. He says there was a lot of self in these answers and not much about the other person. And my God, you walk through our culture these days, and that's what you see. There is just this flood of focus on the self. You hear about self-care, you hear about self-love. I've been seeing this myself, the E's kind of dropped, the E's dropped out. Um, Perfume, cologne, I don't know what it is. I remember there was this ad I saw in the New York Times where it's about another perfume. And this woman is walking through this moonlit landscape and she says, I am nature, I am self. And you wouldn't put that in an ad unless you think people are going to respond like, ooh, she is self. That's a great thing. Uh, I was watching basketball a couple of years ago, and one of the teams had the word self on their jerseys because it turns out their jerseys were, they have jersey sponsors. Their jerseys were sponsored by a financial firm called Self. And it's just everywhere. You and I would walk around the mall and look at t-shirt slogans and mug slogans. And there's almost like a common mood amongst the slogans. Like the t-shirts, like I'm a hot grandma, you know, what do you got to say about that? Or say, that's not one of them, but it was along those lines. Anyway, so what I think Brooks is talking about here in the context of romantic relationships and falling in love, we're just awash in it. It's everywhere in the culture, this celebration of oneself. And it may seem like, well, we should be celebrating ourselves and we need to. And look what religion did to us in the past. It called us all these corrupt, hopeless sinners. And isn't this better? But I think a lot comes along with that celebration of the self that we don't necessarily realize.
What do you think about the argument that where this came from was the discarding of our shared moral, even religious framework for a more therapeutic personal wellness framework? That has been identified as the root of this focus on the self. That's what Brooks points to in his article, and the course talks about these ideas as well. I mean, the course says that the problem that we have here is that the ego has basically taken over our perception. And what is the ego but a focus on the self? Ego is Latin for I. So So, what we're trying to do here from a course perspective is dissolve that self focus. And that seems to parallel perfectly with the critique that what's gone wrong in society and the root of why we can't get along is because we've shifted from a collective to a personal focus. So, what do you make of that argument?
I have felt for years that there's something about therapy, psychotherapy, that has laid a groundwork for this, but it's just been a kind of an intuition from living in the culture. And he provides, I think, a sharper, more informed point to it. And it sounds like an extremely important observation. So what he says, he talks about how there have been these cultural trends. He talks about a 1966 book by Philip Reef called The Triumph of the Therapeutic. And so this is in the mid 60s. And this author is arguing that there had been this sea change there where quietly our old shared moral frameworks, our old shared sacred ideals, centered on truth and on God, had been replaced by therapeutic ideals. So that rather than the person is there to aspire to conform themselves to, that sounds awful nowadays, to align themselves with these sacred ideals, it was all about personal well-being. How do you feel? And what I've been saying to you for some weeks now is what it's about nowadays is feeling good, not being good. And if you just think about how those two things fall on your ear, right? Feeling good, that sounds great. Being good, sounds a bit moralistic. Sounds like I'm being shooted on. Sounds like someone's going to impose their standards on me and limit my freedom and my celebration of myself. But I feel like as simple as that distinction is it about feeling good or being good? It used to be about being good. Now it's about feeling good. It captures something. So then he talks about this 79 book by Christopher Lasch called The Culture of Narcissism. And that book was saying that some of these trends, like the therapeutic focus, was changing us as people. And the idea is that it was producing narcissistic individuals who were self absorbed, fragile, and desperate for recognition. And so, you and I are not versed in some of these cultural studies, and he only quotes those two. But I feel like, and I've been looking into those things in preparation for the podcast, I feel like they were really onto something. It is about how you feel, how good you feel. It is about your well being internally. It is about your wellness. And all of these things tend to take place apart from and as a maybe somewhat covert reaction to the idea that you're supposed to be lining yourself up with shared moral values, with shared notions of truth, with God, right? You don't hear a lot of God talk in the wellness space, right? It's about your wellness. You don't hear a lot of truth talk. I mean, truth, years ago, I remember being in high school and having conversations with people like, so truth is supposed to be relative, but isn't like there's a moon there. No matter what you think about it, it's there. And I remember in the 70s, it was so cool to talk about your truth and my truth. And, we create our own reality. And then over time, that morphed without having to change its identity too much into, well, you have your facts and we have alternative facts. And suddenly, when everyone has their own truth, the bottom starts to fall out.
I think that you have identified something that is eroding society as we know it. And that is this idea that you have your facts and I have my facts. And did that start with this idea of you have your truth and I have my truth? And
I
did
think
it
so.
start with this focus or the shift from the collective to the individual. And I am particularly interested in the way in which it has made us more sensitive and touchy as people, less resilient as people. And so when we're so focused on what's good for us as individuals versus what's good for the collective, then we get into this kind of outrage that we're seeing everywhere. You've offended my sense of self. And once you start offending that sense of self, and everyone has their own reasons to be offended, then we start seeing the kind of breakdown in our personal relationships, the breakdown in our society, and it just goes on from there. And so we are interested in this also because we see it so much here at the Circle. I mean, I remember back when we did our podcast on the characteristics of the advanced teachers of God in the manual, and we talked about this idea that if you don't have trust in God, you have to control things, and if you control, you can't be good. Well, some people kind of lost their mind because it was like, who are you to define what's good? So we don't like to be told what's good and what's truth, and I think that really has spilled into, we don't like to be told what's fact. If your fact disagrees with my fact, then it's not a fact. And what can we have coming from that but conflict?
Yeah. I want to pick up on that because so much of what we do in our teaching at the Circle is try to clarify the course and clarify that it may not mean what you've heard. And in my experience, this idea that, what you and I call the cult of self, that's our shorthand for this whole thing. The cult of self has massively distorted A Course in Miracles. I think A Course in Miracles is the antidote for this. But that perspective has come in and reshaped the course so that the course becomes the spokesman for the cult of self, and it distorts topic after topic after topic after topic and on in the course. It distorts everything it touches in the course, so everything gets reshaped, and topics that are central kind of fall by the wayside and no one talks about them. Topics that are peripheral are brought to the forefront and become central and become distorted and reshaped. And so we are constantly trying to clarify, no, the course is not a spokesman for the cult of self, but in fact, that widespread attitude that kind of governs what feels right to people because they're swimming in it all the time. And so things that sound like it feel right, feel self-evidently true, feel good. That has just completely distorted the course to the point where I think the course's public image is rather narcissistic and immature. And what that means is serious, intelligent, mature people don't come in because they sense that, they see that image from afar and they think, I don't want to be part of that. But they're reacting not to the course, but to this distortion of the course by the cult of self.
I think there's just a distortion in the course and in spirituality in general, where the idea when it's just about you and you're the only one here, and so whatever anyone else is experiencing is secondary to the fact that your journey is the grand glorious you, then again, how can we not get into this kind of conflict? But one of the things that you said just a minute ago that's really interesting to me, and it kind of ties back to the Brooks article, is that one of the main points of his article is that the definition of real love is so different than what love has become these days. And it's interesting that he talks about love in the article in what we know is a very course like way. So, for instance, he says, and this is a quote from the Brooks article, that the blending of one whole person with another whole person reduces the distinction between giving and receiving. Now, that could have come straight out of the Course, because in the Course, to give and receive are one in truth. And what is defined as love conventionally these days is the ego's version of love. I mean, the ego's love language is concern for the self. And so, can you say more about how love is defined in the article and how that strikes you as being similar to how love is defined in A Course in Miracles?
What he's saying is that we think of love very much in these self-centered terms these days. How do you make me feel? How do you see me? Do you make me feel beloved on the earth? And he says traditionally, in what he calls less self-oriented cultures, love is understood, at least it's understood in terms of an ideal, whether we reach that ideal or not, as something where rather than being focused on you, you're kind of going out of yourself. You're falling in love with a person in whom you see qualities you admire. And and you learn to treasure that person. And you find that giving to that person feels good because it's like you're giving to a part of yourself. And so love as traditionally understood is what he calls a decentering. And rather than empowering you, it's almost like a disempowerment because you're losing self-control in a certain sense. So he talks about how traditionally the problem has been seen as self-centeredness, and love has been seen as the cure for that. And, these are things we've been saying here at the circle because, let me just give you a quote here. In this view of love, self centeredness is our main problem, and love is a delicious and demanding remedy. Great line. So the reason this all strikes me as very course like is this is what we've gleaned from the course. For instance, when he says this blending of one whole person with another whole person, you can point to a passage at the beginning of chapter 22 in the text that says that just not in the same words. It talks about the joining or blending of one whole person with another whole person. Then he says that reduces the distinction between giving and receiving. And reducing the distinction between giving and receiving is one of the course's central goals and teachings. And so basically, Brooks is talking about an other oriented love rather than a self centered love. And that's what the course is talking about. The course adds on that that's how we find ourselves, and that's how we ourselves gain by serving the interests of others. Our own interests are served. But Brooks says virtually the same thing in this article. So it is quite striking. And you and I, we were reading it together and just we could not stop exclaiming and, saying things.
Well, yeah, I mean, this idea of love as a decentering thing versus a self-centering thing is really interesting. I think we are by and large uncomfortable with that idea. We have a line from the Course in our wedding vows that all differences between us fade and grow dim and disappear. And the pushback on that I get is that sounds like codependency. That sounds really unhealthy. Are you okay? And that's exactly the mindset that Brooks is pushing back against in this article and that the Course is pushing back against. There are all kinds of unhealthy ways to be in relationship. But if you are in a healthy, I'm going to say it, healthy codependent relationship, then it can be one of the most satisfying and rewarding experiences of love that you can have in this life. I think one of the core things that makes our relationship work is that I really care about what it is that you need and vice versa. I feel fully joined with you on so many things. I'm looking out for your needs, you're looking out for mine, and it's okay if my needs take second place sometimes. They will take first place sometimes, and they will take second place sometimes. Now, I'll give you an example of taking second place. Because when you say my needs take second place, I know already people are like losing their
Sounds
mind
unhealthy.
about, yeah, it sounds really unhealthy. But we have, I'm a step parent to your kids, and it's hard to blend families, particularly when you have two groups of teenagers that are coming together. And so coming into a situation as a stepmom with teenagers is, it can be tough. The kids are wondering, what does this mean, and they don't always know how to treat you, and there's loyalty issues, and where do they place it's really, really tough. And so I had to make a choice for you and what's best for you and your family, to not put my needs first in relation with your children. And so if I had just made the relationship about me and my needs, then I would have been all up in my feelings, like they can't do this and this, but I'm here too, and this isn't fair, and we're the family now, like all of that stuff, right? Like that would have made it very, very self-centered. That is not what you need, and that's not what the kids need. So I realized very quickly that if I wanted to put my need for love and acceptance and family, and to have this whole blended thing work out really well first, then that would have caused me to behave in ways that were different than just trying to give off the I'm going to remove my needs from this situation and make it about your needs and make it about the kids' needs. That's what I'm talking about when I'm saying, like, there are going to be times when, for the sake of the whole, you put your needs second. And you've mentioned to me at various points in your life that relationship has felt to you like you're just the planet orbiting around the sun of the other person. And if life is set up where the other person is just orbiting around the sun of you, that is a recipe for relationship breakdown. And this is what I think we don't see when the culture has told you that relationship is about you and your needs and what they're giving you and what they're not giving you. And if your lens on relationship is that, then you are going to have relationship breakdown, and it's always going to be the other person's fault because they didn't do it right for you. And so again, we have to zoom out and say, why is it that our relationships aren't working? And there's a lot of reasons, but this is a big one.
Huge. It's absolutely huge because the ideal now is I'm magnificent, and therefore I got to claim my right to have somebody with me who recognizes my magnificence. And if they don't, you know, it's over. And I start drawing boundaries. Um, and there's only room for one person to do that, really.
Let's go back to this idea that the focus on the self makes us more insecure, more needy, more separate, more angry, and isolated. So, talk to us about that idea.
Well, after Brooks goes into this long middle section of his piece about how love used to be defined in less self oriented cultures, in more traditional settings, he goes then into towards the closing of the piece and talking about what it's become. And he says, I got to read a couple of lines here. They're just too good. It's been a long time since the prevailing view was that self-centeredness is our main problem. We have too many me decades under our belt for that. And so he's talking about this new ethos where the virtue is not self-effacement, the virtue is self-display. And then he says, I wonder if the general misery and disconnection all around is partly a product of the gradual buildup of the culture of the therapeutic, the narcissistic, which I've been feeling more and more over the last few years. And then he says he wonders if our constant idolizing of the needs of the self doesn't produce strong people, but needy, touchy, and insecure ones, which is, I think, the point you want to talk about. And then I won't go into this too much, but he talks about when he looks at the best sellers in the self-help category these days, he says they are generally not about how to pour out service. They are more often about how to protect yourself from other people. The general theme is don't let other people get you down. Well, that whole idea of my mental health is protecting me from you, that has been, kind of soaking into my mind over the last several years. Yeah, it's all about like, I got to protect myself from you. And if I don't do that, I don't really believe in myself. And that's the very essence of a lack of mental health. And then I also need to heal myself from all the trauma that you gave me in the past. And so you get into this very defensive posture towards other people for the sake of your mental health. And at the end of it all, Brooks is saying, well, you don't become stronger and more robust and more resilient. You become needy, touchy, and insecure. And that list of those three words, I think, for a lot of us, we immediately recognize the kind of persona he's talking about.
We talk so much in classes and whatnot in relation to the ego that what's offended in many situations, interpersonal conflict situations, is your ego. And and what's offended is the image that you hold of yourself. And what's offended is your view that the world is revolving around what's good for you, and put your own oxygen mask on first because it's all about you. And so I think this is a cause and a simple cause and effect to see, because if the world is about you, and how can that not make you more insecure and touchy when you come against something that you feel is offending that grand glorious you? How could you not be more insecure if it's all about you?
True. I think also there's something about the focus on ourselves that erodes our faith in ourselves. We become weaker because there's something about, conversely, there's something about a genuine, healthy, generous focus on other people that strengthens us and makes us happy and frees us. And so as we, treat ourselves, there was that treat yourself thing from that sitcom Parks and Rec that kind of caught on. Um, as we focus on treating ourselves, we become more miserable, we become more fragile because there's an implicit message that watch out, they're gonna do stuff to you. Make sure you protect your fragile self, and
Yeah.
it all backfires.
Well, from a course perspective, the reason why it backfires is it kind of goes back to that cycle that I was talking about earlier, where if you don't have trust in some higher truth, if you don't have trust in God, trust in love, then you have to control. And then if you have to control, you're constantly doing things that are unloving because you've got to get the other people to get in line with what it is that you want. And how else do you do that? But with anger, right? If you're in that mode of control and ego. And so that causes you to behave in ways that are unloving, which from a course perspective is going to deposit, whether you know it or not, a bunch of guilt into your psyche. And then you have to deal with that guilt through projection. And therein lies the issue that it's not you, it's them. And so all of this ties into what the course says is wrong with our world and wrong with our relationships. And so I think we've spent a lot of time on the downside of the focus on the self.
Yeah.
I want to kind of pull us up to what's the benefit when we have an other centered and other oriented love from a course perspective. What does it do for
Well,
us when we're in that place?
the Course says that it does everything for us. It delivers all the things that we've been looking for. That's the way to salvation. That's the way to God. The way to God is through forgiveness here. Forgiveness is other oriented. That's one of the main, I mean, it's a long, long list, but towards the top of the list in my mind is the cult of self has turned course based forgiveness into mainly self forgiveness, forgiveness of self. That's not what it is in the Course. Forgiveness in the Course is like forgiveness as it's been for thousands of years. In this sense, it's about forgiving the other person and letting them off the hook. And then that sets us up to be able to genuinely forgive ourselves. But that is the benefit of what forgiveness is in the Course. It's an other directed gesture that is directed towards them and also for them. It's for their sake. And we just lost all that and made it all about us.
It is interesting. I hadn't thought about this before just now, but in all of the classes that we do on forgiveness, there's inevitably the comments of, I know I really have to forgive myself. And in all of the classes that we've done on the spiritual disease of hate, inevitably there will be comments about, I know I just hate myself. And so there's a pull. The course talks about our pull towards God. There's an ego pull towards the self that I think we should recognize, that if you are in this place where it really is in your mind all about how you're being treated, then that's a flag that this is the ego at work. And I don't want to leave or lose the beauty of what it is to be in a love that is other oriented. It is the most high, grand spiritual adventure of this lifetime to be in a relationship with an other oriented love. It's not that you are self sacrificial, it's that you, together with the other person, are in a joined, truly joined, harmonious, giving space. And if two people are in that giving space, then my God, what is better in this life?
Yeah, I don't know what is better.
I want to ask you a question about this shift from a, collective, moral, ethical, religious, spiritual framework that's focused on everyone to an individual therapeutic framework that's focused on the self. That word therapeutic is not what I was using before reading the Brooks article, although I know you have been highlighting the 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 issues around therapy and how it's pulled us into a focus on the self. But it has to be said that the course has a therapeutic model. Helen and Bill, the scribes, were psychologists. There's a psychotherapy supplement. There's sections in the text about therapy. So what would you say to somebody who's wondering how all this critique of a therapeutic framework fits in the context of A Course in Miracles?
I'd like to sort of draw out a larger picture. I think that the course does talk about Freudian therapy being a revolt against the older Christian theology that preceded it, and you can really see that there is some kind of revolt that took place there. This is in chapter 9, section 5, the unhealed healer. I do think there was something to revolt against, right? In that old Christian framework, there's a lot that we would want and have wanted to have improved. So, there were these standards that ultimately were God's standards, right? They were standards of truth, they were standards of morality and ethics, they were standards of religious law. And the idea was the individual self was subject to them in a fairly kind of ugly and painful way, where we could never quite conform ourselves to those standards. And then when we couldn't, we were under the threat of eternal divine wrath. Uh, what a horrible scenario. So there was something in that I think we all revolted against. And what came in was this, as we've been saying, therapeutic focus. And a lot of commentators I'm learning have seen what started out as therapy with Freud, for instance, flow right into spirituality, the new age, self-help, wellness. All of these are saying, hey, let's just set those old moralistic frameworks aside. Let's set aside that God who's always threatening to punish you. Let's have a situation in which the self is not so like cruelly accountable to these outside standards of truth and God and so on. Let's make it about the self. Let's make it about you so that you can just focus on being well and healthy and well adjusted and happy and so on. And I think in that process, we lost something precious because we need standards of truth. We need God. And so I strongly suspect that this is a phase in our civilization. I don't know how long it will go on for. Sometimes phases go on a long time. But that eventually we need to come to some kind of synthesis where, yes, there are standards of truth. Yes, there is a God. There are principles that are rooted in reality. They're not just rooted in what works and what feels good. And yes, ultimately, we do need to find our well being. We do need to find happiness. And we don't want to just be under the thumb of some religious worldview and system. So at some point, we need to blend or synthesize what we lost, those frameworks that we lost that are objective or seen as objective, and this focus on our own psychological well being. And at some point, when we're done with the current phase, let's hope, and I do expect we will find that synthesis. And when we're ready for it, I think the course is that synthesis. So, yes, the course is very psychological, very psychotherapeutic, but its way of healing our minds and finding our own wellness, so to speak, our own well being, is to basically align our minds with what is objectively real, with God, with reality, so that it's not just like, well, I'm throwing away those frameworks that I'm accountable to so I can feel good. It's I'm finding my good feeling, my happiness through realizing what is forever real, regardless of what anybody thinks, and coming into alignment with that so that I realize that, I wake up to that, and now my psychotherapeutic well-being and objective eternal reality are one and the same thing. So I think the course holds the answer to what we need when we're done with this current phase, which I think is kind of killing us along the way.
I hope you're right about this being a phase. The thing that concerns me, as you just mentioned, is how long will the phase last? There's a phrase you have to drink your tears before you change. What I'm afraid of is that it's just going to have to get bad enough with this separation, this isolation, this focus on the self before we realize it's not the grand, glorious thing that we thought it was. It's actually what's causing the erosion of society and at the root of why we can't get along. And until and unless we come to that realization and stop glorifying the self, then we're just going to keeps being surrounded in all this dysfunction and not knowing exactly what's causing it. The problem has to be named in order for it to be resolved. And I look back, speaking of your kids, there, Miranda's been in a study of World War II, and being here in England, you're surrounded by remnants and relics and memories of World War II. And it was admirable that the British public was able to come together and make sacrifices, collective sacrifices, because there was that shared value. Fascism is bad. We can't even agree that fascism is bad right now. And so if we can't even agree on like the most basic facts, then how are we ever going to find our way back to those collective shared values that could cause us all to row forward together for the good of everyone? We can't even agree that something good for everyone is a good thing for the world. And so that's where I think the Course can come in and really be the healing balm for the ills of the world, because the Course comes in and says, everyone matters. Everyone has the light of God in them. And until and unless we start seeing that invisible divine reality in each other, we're just going to keep being plagued by these same egoic problems that have dogged us since the dawn of time. And so I think we'll end it there.
I do want to mention his final paragraph before we close. And we do have a
Sure.
few minutes. So he says that I sometimes hear people say that you have to love yourself before you can love others. Well, we don't sometimes hear that. We hear that all the time. Put your own mask on first. He says, but this is backward. You have to observe yourself loving others before you can see yourself as lovable and before you genuinely are lovable. Now, the Course would say you're lovable under all conditions if you're seen for who you really are as God created you. But anyway, I have been saying for more years than I can count that the Course's thing is you find a love for yourself through first loving others, forgiving them, serving them, joining with them, considering their interests to be yours, considering their gain to be your gain. That's in the Course how we come to love ourselves. So it's great just to see it on paper in that way. I mean, I don't agree. I often have reactions to David Brooks's politics. It's not like we are in lockstep with him, but he's got his finger on a really important pulse, I think. And it's interesting, in a not too distant piece, about a year or so ago, he was talking about just having spontaneous experiences of what the Course would call vision. Seeing the radiance, some kind of otherworldly radiance in other people, just having it come over him in certain circumstances. I feel like he's onto something. And there were
Mm-hmm.
certain places in this article that made me even wonder, like, he hasn't cracked open the Course. I don't think he has. That would really surprise me. But there's a goodness in this perspective that he's putting out that we need. We need to start charting our path out of the cult of self to something that, again, returns us to some sense of higher standards, but higher standards that really promote our well-being rather than make us kind of pawns that suffer and sin and get punished forever because of those standards.
That idea of having to love other people before you can see yourself as lovable is so course-like.
So
You're
course-like.
forgiving by extending love to other people, and that's how you forgive yourself. If we had a path that said you have to forgive yourself before you can forgive other people, well, we'd never get anywhere because we'd be stuck in the cycle of forgiving ourselves. But I'm a course
That's how it
student
goes, right?
in part because I love this idea of extension to others is how we get home. And I'll tell you from personal experience, I have never felt more advanced on my spiritual path than I have in doing things like putting the needs of my stepkids above the hurt and the pain and the need I feel myself to be accepted. And you get into something like that and you're like, gosh, I was able to do something truly good there. And and then you feel like, oh, I'm making progress on my spiritual path. That's the thing that makes me feel like I'm making progress, when I'm able to take something that would have otherwise been completely self-centered and making it, about what I need in this situation, and saying, okay, what's the highest good, putting my needs second to the highest good, and highest good means highest good for all. And that's
Yeah.
when you really start to feel like you're getting somewhere with your spiritual development. And that's what we're here to do.
Yeah. And I mean, as you know, I tell you all the time, watching you be a stepmom, you have really such, and you can edit this out if you want, but you have such lovely qualities as a stepmom. As you know, I had a stepmom in my 20s, and my dad remarried, and she really strongly believed in ego. And she didn't have a good feeling about the course for that reason. She believed that ego was the thing to put yourself forward, to tell people that's not acceptable. She was kind of the original Karen. Um, and it may have felt good to her. I don't know. But on the receiving end, it was like her ego took up a lot of space in that situation. And it is lovely to see someone be a stepmom who is genuinely there for the children and for all concerned without being in denial of her own needs, without being some kind of zombie, but still sincerely there because it has lifted, I think, the whole situation.
Well, we'll close with that. I just think there's so many situations like step parenting is just so obvious and easy because it's a situation where one person comes in and can so easily and clearly throw their stake in the ground and say, it's about me now.
Right.
And how often do we do that in all kinds of other situations in the world? And could that be the reason why our relationships aren't working, that we put our stake in the ground and we say it's about me now? And that is not the glorious grand thing that we've been promised it is. It's actually the thing that's poisoning it all. And we should take a hard look at that. So we'll leave it there. Thank you for watching or listening to our podcast. If you'd like to come to an Exploring A Course in Miracles live in the future, you're welcome to join our community at circleofa.org/community. And we hope you will. On behalf of Robert and me and everyone at the Circle, thank you so much for watching and listening. And we'll see you next time. Bye for now.